Well, you're the one who knows what your audience wants to hear. So,
well, 21 episodes, maybe I don't.
No, it's a cool thing you're doing. And are you getting any support for this, or is it just a little passionate hobby?
$6 a month so far. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer, and this is episode number 22. My guest for this episode is Mike O'Connor. Mike O'Connor is a musicologist at Palm Beach Atlantic University and an expert on the music of the Civil War and the period right up to John Philip Sousa. Before we begin, I need to ask a favor. If you enjoy this podcast, would you please take a moment and go to iTunes and leave me a rating? This will help spread the word about the show and bring the podcast to more listeners. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Great. Thanks for joining me. I'm really excited about this. You sent me an email about your research into historical bands, and Thomas Coates in particular.
Yeah, I remember hearing your podcast with my friend Michael Colburn, and I thought, I think, some historical band, information would be great for this as well.
I think so too. I don't think we have enough pre-Sousa knowledge in this world. I think I talk with a lot of my guests about how there's a lot of churn in the recent band music, but we also don't look back at all. I think the oldest most music people play is either the Sousa or the Holst, some of the Granger stuff, but we don't go much past that.
Yeah, and I think the biggest reason for that is the instrumentation issues. Once you go farther back into band history, you start getting into configurations of instruments which most people don't deal with. And if you go back far enough into the 1870s and 1860s, then you got to deal with the E-flat cornet problem, in which there's just not a lot of expert players on that these days. And of course, with students, you have the issue of that's just not an instrument you want them playing right away.
Sure. I want to come back to this. Let's talk about you a little bit before we get in. Let's let the listeners know what you're all about.
Okay.
All right. So tell the audience about yourself. What are you doing now?
Well, I'm an associate professor of music history here at Palm Beach Atlantic University in West Palm Beach, Florida. I've been here now 10 years. My principal research interest actually is the Spanish Renaissance, sacred music of that. That's what I did my dissertation on. But I'm a euphonium player, and that just doesn't go away. So I've combined my interest in playing, low brass instruments with music history. And so I have a secondary research path in which I look at 19th century band music and occasionally even into the 20th century orchestral literature as well. I've dabbled in some American music topics here and there. But my big project these days is 19th century band music, and I put together a couple of groups to that effect, which we play period instruments, and done a couple of recordings, and I've done some papers on that. But that's where I'm at these days. So I get to still play my horn, and I get to do my research, which I'm supposed to do.
Sure. So now I also know that you founded the Orchid City Brass Band, which is a British brass band.
Yeah, I mean, I really love brass band music. As a euphonium player, it's hard not to, because the parts are just so good, and you get to play not only euphoniums but baritone horns and E-flat tubas and things like that. So a couple of my friends and I decided to form a brass band here in West Palm Beach called the Orchid City Brass Band. We're named after West Palm Beach, which is the Orchid City, and we've been having great fun with that. It's a very fine group.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun. The music's great. So what's your origin story? How did you get into music, and what led you to a professional career in music?
Well, I'm like probably a lot of your listeners. I got started in band in 4th grade in Paducah, Kentucky, and then we moved around a bit. So I played in junior high and high school bands in Paris, Tennessee, and then over to Springfield, Missouri, which I had the singular experience of trying out for the tennis team there and having to play Brad Pitt for the final spot on the team. He won, by the way. But
was he any good?
Yeah, he was a pretty good player. I mean, I did a little bit of double faulting and things, but that's another story. So I went up through high school band. I started on the cornet, switched over to the euphonium because no one else was playing it in the band at the time. And I just kind of fell in love with the instrument and eventually decided to go to college and major in music education. I went first to what's now Missouri State University, spent a year there, and then went on to Tennessee Tech because I heard that's where the best tuba and euphonium players were, and I wanted to sort of see where I was, against that crew. And so I played with the Tennessee Tech Tuba Euphonium Ensemble, was principal euphonium with them for a while, and then went to Arizona State for graduate school. In the midst of that, I did audition for the West Point Band. Fell just a little bit short of that, but it was a great experience. And then I went and played with the Clyde Beatty and Cole Brothers Circus Band for about 5 years as a euphonium player. So I had the singular distinction of being a professional euphonium player but not having to wear stripes. And then after that, I decided, the road was enough, and I decided to go and teach band for a while. I did one entire year teaching in the public schools, and down in Sweetwater, Tennessee. I love that place. It was a great place, but there were reasons I had to go back to graduate school. And while I was there, I picked up the music history bug and just decided to go that route for my career.
Okay. Did you play in high school band?
I did, yes.
And so, obviously, as a euphonium player, that was probably an easy question. But what was that experience like? Do you remember your director, and was that sort of the singular experience, or was there something else?
Well, and one thing I left out, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I did play in high school band, played euphonium. I had a couple of directors because I changed schools. My first high school band director was a guy named Tony Yates, great guy. He got me interested in marching band. And of course, playing well and all those sorts of things. And then when I moved to Missouri, I had a guy named Ernie Pratt, who was more of an orchestral fellow. So I began to learn a little bit more things outside of band, like, there was orchestras and jazz bands and things like that. And so I also took up the bass guitar and played in the jazz band there. And then, since I really love marching band, decided to go out and play drum and bugle corps for a couple of years with the Skyriders out of Hutchinson, Kansas, 1981, 1982. And that just, made me want to really go into music education for a career.
Mm-hmm. Who was your teacher at Tennessee Tech?
At Tennessee Tech, Ralph Winston Morris, one of the greatest tuba teachers of all time. Half the military bands are filled with his, tuba students and euphonium players. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to go there. He had recruited me in Tennessee while I was there. But when I moved to Missouri, I decided to come back because he just kept calling.
Sure. And then, of course, you went to Arizona State with Dan Parentoni.
Right, with Dan Parentoni. I only spent a semester with him because I left to go play with the circus band spring semester. But that was a great experience, too. He was, of course, a fine teacher, learned a great deal, and just, basically grew up as a musician, with all of these really excellent teachers.
Sure. I know entirely too much about the tuba and euphonium world.
Well, that's not a bad thing.
I seem to have lots of friends that are low brass players, so I mean, it's okay with me. You're all really nice people. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's get into your research. And so I guess the best place to start is to talk about the development of the American band tradition prior to the Civil War and then the impact that the Civil War had on it.
We could talk for days on that, but I'll sort of give you the nutshell. American bands started very much like European bands did, mostly woodwind groups with a couple of brass instruments, because back in the 18-teens and 1820s, essentially we had, valveless brass instruments. So you had the trumpets and natural horns, and the good groups had trombones as well. And eventually, over time, the brass band thing comes along, and it starts in Europe. It doesn't really start here, but of course, Americans being, always sort of on the trailing edge of everything musical in those days, decide to sort of copy the English and the German styles of brass band. And that's really important. We forget that, most of the musicians in America in the first part of the 19th century were Germans. So, their style of music was our style of music for quite a long time. And if you look at most of the bands, especially in New England and the Middle Atlantic states, most of the players are Germans. By the end of the century, of course, you get an awful lot of Italians coming in too, but that's a different part of the trajectory. So we start getting a lot of these valve brass instruments coming in about the late 1830s, early 1840s, being developed in Europe. And once we get those, the band movement basically takes off. And so your typical band, I guess, from about the late 1840s would have been a mixture of keyed bugles. That would have been the lead instrument, the E-flat keyed bugle, played by people like Ned Kendall or Frank Johnson, some of these fantastic instrumentalists. They were the lead guitar players of their day. They were just incredible musicians. And then, of course, with them, they would have had a B-flat bugle as well. And some of the cornets were starting to come in, so you might have a E-flat cornet in there as well, or a B-flat cornet. They were supporting instruments at that time. And then, of course, you had an E-flat trumpet as well. This was actually a pretty important instrument in those days and served sort of as a bridge between the bugle and the lower instruments. So you'd also have some what we call alto horns today. They had several names in those days, like ebrocorno. And then, of course, a tenor instrument, usually trombones, and then your bass instruments, which would be probably in the early days a bass horn or an ophicleide a little bit later. And by, I'd say the 1850s, you finally have the tubas coming in, the E-flat tubas especially. And then, of course, you can mix in some percussion if you like.
And so when do we have the baritone euphonium?
Well, those instruments come in, we see them sporadically in the late 1840s, but by about 1852, that's where I've been looking at lately, they're well established. Sometimes they're called bass, B-flat bass, other times called baritone, so we don't really have the terminology set yet. The term euphonium doesn't come along for quite some time because, again, we were influenced so much by the Germans who had always called that instrument the baritone. So, yeah, so we always called it that for a long time, and then it really was not until the 20th century before, the term euphonium actually starts to gain some traction. Yeah, and that instrument doesn't even make its appearances in orchestras until the late 19th century, am I correct? I mean, we don't see it in orchestral tradition either. Oh, right. The Civil War, to me, my father was a history teacher for his entire career, so I have a little bit of it in me. And, the Civil War to me is sort of the pivotal moment in our country and sort of the trajectory of this country. And so it's also it must be a pivotal moment in the development of music and bands in the U.S. Yeah. In a way, it certainly is. The 1850s really are the big time for brass bands in this country. If you go back and read the old Dwight's journal, you read all sorts of things about the rise of these brass bands. Dwight himself was not a big fan, of course. He really wanted Americans to embrace Beethoven and of course the orchestra, but he talks about it so much in the negative that we learn quite a bit about what was happening in brass bands. My research lately has been looking at a lot of the music from the 1850s, and the bands were just springing up everywhere. And these were mostly professional bands playing for dances, playing for promenades, again, sort of emulating the English tradition set up by a Frenchman, Julien. He's the one who sort of gets all this idea of brass bands playing popular music. And so you start seeing a lot of manuscript music for these bands. Now, they were the ones who eventually went off to play with the regiments in the Civil War. And their instrumentation would have been a number of E-flat cornets. The bugle basically had sort of faded away by the 1850s, the middle of the 1850s, and the cornet had taken over. It was just a lot easier to deal with as far as maintenance and a lot easier to play, to be honest. And so we'll probably have 2, 3, 4, maybe even a half a dozen E-flat cornet players because that's where the melody was. And then you had the B-flat cornets. The first B-flat would have doubled the melody very frequently with the E-flats, that making it a very difficult instrument to play because you got to deal with that tuning. And then you'd have a second B-flat cornet playing a lot of harmony parts. And then from there, you'd have the E-flat altos, probably 2 or 3 of those. And then the B-flat tenors, valved instruments by now. The trombones were found to, of course, be, again, not that easy to maintain. And then, of course, you'd have the baritone and the E-flat basses. Now, as we get into the Civil War, these bands eventually attached themselves to regiments. And so, in the early days of the Civil War, everybody thought it would last 90 days. And so these highly professional ensembles would hook themselves up with a regiment and basically go off to war. Of course, the most famous of them was the 7th Regiment Band. Went off with the New York 7th Regiment, and that was led by Griffulla. And that would be like, a National Guard group going off to Afghanistan and taking U2 with them. I mean, these bands were so popular that they would have been that equivalent to that. And so we also had an awful lot of other bands going off, who didn't take all of their members. And I remember White mentions this in his book on American bands. You can't trust much in that book, but this is definitely true. Some of the important bands would say, hey, we're going to go off with this regiment. But the problem is not everybody wanted to go. So they would have to kind of cobble together, players from all sorts of different groups. And so the band that went out probably was not as good as the one everybody knew, say, from New York or Boston or Providence and those places. And so, have the same instrumentation, but you had all these different bands, and some would form up, half the guys not even knowing how to play yet. And they would sort of learn on the job because every regiment wanted a band. Now, this lasted until 1862. When the government realized, hey, this war is going to go on for a while. And so the government decided we're going to, muster out all of the regimental brass bands, going to send them all home because this is costing way too much. And so basically the Union Army, the Confederates had a different system, but the Union Army lost all of their bands. Now, what do these regiments do because they love their bands? Well, they find loopholes in the new law. They go off and they recruit new members for the companies, because what could happen is that the regiment could form its own brass band if it wanted to, but it had to take only 2 members from each company of the regiment and basically designate them to service with the band. They would be privates, essentially. And so they would go and recruit back in their hometowns musicians to come out. They would designate them to a company and then redesignate them back to a brass band. And so in 1863 to 1865, you had almost as many bands as you had before.
I see. And so how many new musicians were being trained during the Civil War, or were they all people who could play coming in?
Well, you had quite a mix of them. You had a lot of people who were mustered out the first time around who decided to come back, being very, very patriotic, or they just liked Army life. I can't imagine that, but they but they came back. And a lot of musicians who didn't come out the first time decided to come because there were bonuses, to be paid, and they maybe had second thoughts about not volunteering the first time. But then again, you did have a lot of guys who, basically, okay, I will sign up, basically being promised to be a musician because I can sort of, barely play an instrument or something like that. And what happens is you have a ton of practice time, while you're in a regiment in the Civil War. I mean, we hear about all the big battles, but we don't really hear so much about just the months of downtime that these armies had. And so these guys practiced a lot. There's very famous stories, of course, about I think there was a Minnesota regiment who spent all this money to buy instruments for their band. They tried to get the guys to learn the instruments. They didn't play very well, so certain members would of the regiment would surreptitiously break the instruments, or they would just let them fall into disuse and not repair them, and then eventually send those guys home because they were just so terrible. But there were an awful lot of musicians, in both armies of the Civil War. And of course, when the war ended, they came home and, started playing in their towns. A lot of professional bands started up, and of course we have sort of the beginnings of the town band movement, the 1870s.
I was going to ask about that because you mentioned German brass bands, and of course the part of the country where you grew up and where I'm currently living, around St. Louis and throughout that Midwest up into Iowa and Minnesota, we see that the band tradition is very strong still. And this is, of course, the homeland of Carl King and the great March Masters. And
oh, yeah, and all of those guys were trained by people who had probably played in the Civil War, like, C.G. Kahn, he was part of a regiment, and others, so they all kind of, the second wave of musicians, during what I like to think of as the real golden age of band music was the 1870s and 1880s and into the 1890s. This was a time when almost any town, if it had a building, it had a band. It was considered to be something you had to have. It's sort of like McDonald's today. Every little town that has McDonald's is an official town.
Sure. So let's make that connection then. After the Civil War to that golden age, how did that sort of come about, and what were the catalysts for that golden age?
Well, a couple of things. First, you have a lot of instruments, because a lot of instruments were made to service the two big armies, the North and South, and so you have a lot of these instruments hanging around, and so they come back with them, and so they were proficient musicians. They liked playing. This is sort of a way for them to have sort of I like to think of it as a informal VFW in a way, or a way to kind of associate with their army mates. And of course, younger people come into the group, and you have these traditions established. And then, of course, you have the great factories in, not so much in America, but in Europe, churning out new brass instruments by the literally hundreds of thousands a year to supply, of course, European groups, but also American bands would buy these things like as a set. And you could get them all the way from the most wonderful French instruments to the very, very bargain basement ones made in Austria at the time. And so, whatever the band could afford, they could get an entire set of instruments. And so you had not only these town bands, but you also had, the professional bands playing, in which they naturally would have the more finer instruments, and they would tour around. And of course, they would inspire the town bands to, greater, proficiency. And of course, one of the other things going on at the time too was this Victorian notion of music making you a better person. And so, this, of course, comes over from England and to some degree Germany, but mostly from England. And so you had this idea, the brass band movement starting in England in the 1850s, is that, if working class people would play music, they would become elevated and not so crude and coarse. And so you have, of course, the British brass band tradition starting over in England, in the mines and places like that. Well, you have a parallel to that here over in the States too. You had brass and wind bands by this time being formed, in fire companies. You have them formed in mines. You have them formed in factories, and as well as towns. So basically, and of course the police bands as well. You have all of these bands. And, they are the musical soundscape of America. I mean, you have the big cities, which can have orchestras and things like that. But anywhere else, the musical sounds that you would hear would be coming from these bands.
Sure. That's really interesting. And so it's easy to see the connection between the German brass bands and the British brass bands. What kind of music were American brass bands playing at the time? I know that you mentioned to me Thomas Coates, a name that I'm unfamiliar with, but you call him the great composer before John Philip Sousa?
Well, that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because if you look at his monument in Easton, Pennsylvania, it says "Father of Band Music in America." Now that's quite a claim, for somebody that no one's ever heard of. But that intrigued me. That got me thinking, okay, why did his friend say this? This is a rather, bold pronouncement. And so I began looking into him a little bit. I first discovered him because I do Civil War band playing as well. I put together a band called the Coates Brass Band, of all things. And it's based on the 47th Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment, in which he served. The Easton band went off to war with them. And the reason I did that originally was because I wanted to bring some of my friends down to Florida to play, because I kind of missed it up in Pennsylvania where I lived before. And I did a little research and found that the 47th Pennsylvania had played at the Fort Zachary Taylor in Key West, Florida. And so I thought, okay, we'll represent them. That'll be kind of fun. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized, hey, this is a really good band. And it was led by a guy who was, a quite well-known band composer at the time. In the 1850s, Thomas Coates was one of the biggest names in band music, along with Claudio Grafula, Alan Dodworth, and even Patrick Gilmore, probably the younger end of that range. But everybody knew who Thomas Coates was, and he had just written tons and tons of band music, along with other things as well. But by the 1870s and 1880s, his name had sort of faded a little bit. He had not composed nearly as much, but people still knew who he was. The reason he was so important is because he did some things with the brass band that were a little bit different. Whereas somebody like Claudio Grafula would write sort of in the standard, here are the E-flat cornets, they get the melody, everybody else gets a very supporting part. The baritone will play occasionally octaves with the B-flat cornet. The first alto, the solo alto, will play octaves with the E-flat cornet. And that was sort of the way that everybody composed in those days, sort of melody and then supporting instruments. Coates thought, well, you know what? These inner instruments could do some really cool things too. And also we can write harmonies that are a little bit more advanced, things that he's hearing from, great orchestral music. And there's even some moments that almost sound jazz-like. And I only say that because he spent most of his youth sort of traveling the South. And so he probably heard a lot of real African-American music, not just, the minstrel stuff that he was so fond of. But there's all of this, just this kaleidoscope of American sounds in his music. And as we played and recorded some of it, we would get to a chord and think, oh, well, that must be wrong. And we're thinking, well, no. I mean, look, you have all these notes and all these different instruments, and they all line up. It must be him just being, a little bit of a maverick here.
I'm most interested in how we get to where we are. And so we have Thomas Coates and we have the golden age in the 1870s. So after the Civil War, was he still writing throughout the late 19th century?
Yeah, in the 1870s, he went to New York this for the second time to sort of take up, arranging and things like that. He led a couple of different bands here and there. He didn't have his own band in New York, but he eventually found that that wasn't working for him. So he came back to Easton and led the Easton band there, called the Coates Band at the time. And he did some composing. He was already getting to be a fairly older fellow there. We don't know how old he was. His tombstone says 1803 he was born. But that would have put him in his 90s when he died. So we're thinking maybe closer to 1818 or something like that. So he's probably in his late 70s, 80s. And, the last picture of him shows him as a very old man. But there were other composers at this time. The music publishing was becoming a thing in the United States. And so these bands now had access to not just the things that their own leaders were arranging for them, but things that the great arrangers in America, many of them German, were writing for the big houses. I'm just looking at a couple of names here that I jotted down just to remind myself. We have people like William Petty, doing for the Richards Company. Tom Coates, did for Richards, Harry Coleman, Schott, and Pepper. And then George Southwell out in Kansas City had his own company to do that with. One of my favorites is a guy named J.B. Klaus, who did a lot of arranging for Thompson and Odell. He took a lot of the sort of great orchestral literature and converted it into band arrangements. So a lot of Americans probably heard this music only from the sound of bands at that time. And then some German names like George Schliefarth or Justus Ringleben. And then, of course, you had the great Canadian arranger Laurendeau, who did some of those really giant arrangements in the 1890s for the Fisher Company. And so you had all these people writing, mostly dance music. So you had, polkas and schottisches and waltzes and things like that, because, these were dance bands, first and foremost. And then, of course, you had the arrangements of the orchestral literature and opera. Everyone loved opera in those days. It was, sort of the big age of opera, all the way from Verdi up through Wagner, during that time. And then, of course, the popular music of the time. And now a lot of the popular music came, from the pen of Stephen Foster. Everyone loved Stephen Foster tunes, so you had millions of arrangements of those things. And then, of course, you had, the new music coming out of Broadway at the time. A lot of Irish things.
Victor Herbert is a name I always think of.
Yeah, period. And he's at the tail end of that too. I think of a guy named David Bram is a name that every American musician should know. He wrote so many popular songs in the from the 1860s up through about the 1890s, I think. And so a lot of his music shows up in band arrangements. And then, of course, the beginnings of Tin Pan Alley are happening during this time too. So you get band arrangements of popular songs from there, and then, of course, the arrangements of the ethnic melodies, I like to call them, arrangements of, Irish melodies. You had the minstrel melodies. Everybody still loved that. That went all the way until the 20th century, by the way. And then, of course, you had the Italian things eventually coming in. And then a little bit of the exotic, too. You start hearing arrangements, from South America, Russian things that, that Americans were starting to get interested in sort of the exotic at that time. So it was a very rich literature.
Sure, that's sort of the era when a huge percentage of Americans played instruments, could read music. Do you know that number? At some point, I saw an astronomical number, something around 90% of Americans could read music in the 1890s.
I don't know that number offhand. I'm sure it's searchable, but
I'm just wondering if I'm just anecdotally saying that and don't know I don't know for sure, but I seem to remember that.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, we were a very musical society. In fact, all of Western civilization was very musical in those days. For the practical reason of if you wanted music, you had to make it yourself, of course, or listen to someone else making it. But also, again, that Victorian notion of, to be sort of a proper middle-class person, you had to have some musical ability. You had to, be able to show that, you could play the piano, maybe sing a little bit. In those days, the guitar was also very popular. So play that or a band instrument. Any of those things could show that, you were, part of the club, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So is the Easton Band still playing?
They are. We did a side-by-side concert with them a couple of years ago to commemorate the Easton Band coming back from their time, with the 47th Pennsylvania. It's a very small band, but, like a lot of community bands, very enthusiastic, some really wonderful people, and it was a great experience for us.
Now, when did we start to when did the brass band or the band tradition begin to infiltrate into schools? I know we have the stories of Illinois in the early part of the 20th century, but did it happen before, or is that the typical story?
Well, I did a little work on this. This is not my main research thing, but I did a little, looking at this because I know you had wondered about that question. And it seems like every time I find, this might be one of the earliest schools to have, band as a extracurricular activity, I kept finding one earlier and one earlier than that. It really goes all the way back to Lowell Mason bringing in music into the schools, which was mostly vocal music at that time. But very soon, I'd say by the time that we start seeing bands in America, you start seeing bands as part of education process at some form or another, especially in places like orphanages. That music had always been sort of a very big thing in orphanages, going all the way back to, of course, Vivaldi. You know about that story. But they would form these, orphanage bands. Of course, the Native American schools, for, as unfortunate as that situation was, a lot of those, guys learned how to play band instruments as part of that experience. And then when you started getting public schools, bands, of course, were becoming part of that experience as well, again, as a extracurricular activity. It wasn't until about the 1920s do we start actually seeing it coming into the public schools. And this sort of coincides with the decline of the professional band movement.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seamlessly goes from this is a professional activity, it's a community activity in some cases, to becoming a school activity. And the one reason I can see for that is jazz.
Yeah, the jazz age is certainly...
It takes over as the popular music and pushes, the band, out. And so as these players begin to say, well, okay, what am I going to do now? I'm not really a jazz player. Well, they become music teachers in the schools.
Yeah, they adapt, much like we see nowadays where musicians are adapting what they're doing.
Of course, yeah.
It's really fascinating, that period of time. The development of jazz, of course, begins prior to the Civil War, but it really coalesces there in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And it also coincides with recording and Edison's recording and the development of reproduced music. And so there's less of a need for literacy.
Right. Jazz may never have gotten out of the Delta or the New Orleans area or possibly Chicago if it weren't for recordings. And then radio, of course. I mean, most Americans first heard jazz on the radio before they ever went and bought a recording of it.
Sure. So now what can we do as modern musicians or modern band teachers to sort of pay tribute or to this era? Or is there even a need for that?
Oh, I think there is a need for that. I would say first and foremost, and at the college level, that band directors who might teach a band history course, or most of our band history at the college level, sort of comes informally during rehearsals. There are not that many band history courses. I wish there were more, but they should let their students know that there was a time before Sousa. I mean, many of us know about, of course, the Civil War bands because that's, we see those at reenactments and there's lots of recordings of them.
And there's pictures.
Yeah, exactly. And pictures, yeah. But the time where there are even more pictures, to be honest, is from the 1870s and 1880s, where we start to take the all brass band of the Civil War and we begin to sprinkle it with a few woodwind instruments. The sort of the standard instrumentation for an 1880s band would have been that core Civil War style band, of course, with newer instruments, but also with about 4 or 5 clarinets in there as well, and a D-flat piccolo. So we add these woodwind instruments. At first, the idea was to sort of reinforce the melody, because they basically just double the cornets for the most part. But you get occasionally guys like Thomas Coates, for example, or Patrick Gilmore saying, the woodwinds can do a bit more. And look what's happening over in Europe. They're starting to really expand, the woodwind part of the band. So perhaps we should do the same and start giving the clarinets more independent parts. And then, of course, as they become more independent, the section grows a bit larger. You start adding the new saxophones when they come in. And, of course, the different sizes of clarinets. And I'd say by the 1890s, you have, what we'd recognize as a symphonic band today. And, of course, that was helped along by the change of style that Sousa brings in the 1880s. We do concerts, my goodness, playing this 1870s, 1880s music with our configuration, which has just the 4 clarinets and the piccolo and the brass. And then we always do an encore of Sousa, and the audience is always so amazed how different the style is. His approach to the band was just revolutionary, and basically everybody took that forward, and the old style of band really fell away, and became forgotten again because the instrumentation is quite a bit different. So people tend to look at it and say, well, we don't have that, or what are we going to do with the saxophones here? They just sort of ignored that music.
Interesting. So Sousa was kind of like a big bang in the band world. He sort of changed the direction.
Very much so. His style was just so different than the contemporary arranging style of the time, and plus he was a composer. I mean, most of the and there are a lot of compositions, yes, in the band world, but the big thing was arranging. Arranging orchestra, opera music, popular songs, that sort of thing. Sousa did that as well, of course, we know. But he also decided to, compose these great marches, and so the march begins to become sort of, the quintessential band music, whereas the quick step and other dances had been before that. and of course, many other things come along with that too. The change over from the E flat cornet being the primary melody instrument to the B flat cornet now being the primary melody instrument. That starts about the late 1870s and the 1880s. And of course, you look at the scoring. Even Sousa still carries an E flat cornet, basically just out of habit more than anything else.
Yeah, that instrument. What is that like? That E flat cornet, and do we see them often?
Well, you see them mostly today in British brass bands. They carry one who plays sort of like a piccolo type role in the British brass band. The E-flat cornet for the Civil War brass band, of course, was the melody instrument. It was, naturally a bit higher pitched, and you just had the most amazing players playing it. As we get into the late 1870s, 1880s, for some reason it changed. I think it was more of a preference rather than just losing the great E-flat players. The B-flat just took over, and I think that had a lot to do with people like Arbin, who was a B-flat player.
I was going to ask if improved technique just among the general populace, but that doesn't make sense to me because, of course, there's still great trumpet players during that era.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, I don't think really we can't look at as musicians got better. It's really just. That's always a very dangerous way to look at music history in general. Would you look at just changes of taste? And I think that's the way it was. Is especially once we started adding the woodwinds, we didn't really need the E flat player to carry the melody like we did before. So now we take it down the interval to B flat. And it just blends better, I think.
I always think of the E flat trumpet and the piccolo trumpet, and in the B flat, they all have a very distinct sound. But the B flat has a brilliance that the other two don't.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the instruments that you're talking about. For example, the Civil War brass band instruments. These are all made of German nickel silver for the most part, and they have a fairly dark tone to them. Mm-hmm. And of course, as we go through the 19th century, we still have quite a bit of that, But now you can actually have the cornets function as brass instruments in this now mixed brass and reed band, and that I think probably makes the instrument makers make the instruments a little bit more brilliant like that.
Sure. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. There's so much here to talk about still that we haven't. But so I want to ask you, your research. You said that your dissertation's in the Spanish Renaissance, but you've done a lot of research, obviously, into this. Do you have any sort of forthcoming publications?
My publications, in quotes, lately have been recordings.
Oh, okay.
The two period instrument groups that I founded, one was the Coates Brass Band. We did a recording on MSR Classics of the mostly 1850s music of Thomas Coates, the stuff that would have been played during the Civil War and before that. So we used Civil War style instruments for that. Uh-huh. And then my second recording I did with my other group called Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band. And this is an 1880s style mixed brass and reed band. And we did the later music of Thomas Coates, everything sort of after the war that was actually published. Everything we recorded there was, actually in print, except for one piece, which was a manuscript we found in Allentown. So basically anything that Coates wrote and has survived, we've now recorded it, so it's available on those two recordings. And so of course a lot of my research went into the program notes and choosing music and all that sort of thing. But I will be presenting a paper on Thomas Coates at the Society for American Music in the end of February, 1st of March in 2018. And then of course I'm working on a book right now which surveys all of the surviving music of essentially what I like to call the E-flat cornet era. Everything from the late 1830s up to about 1870. And so I had to draw some lines somewhere. Sure. But I'm basically looking through all of the manuscripts and all of the printed stuff I can find to basically create a catalog of it and identify all of the opera tunes that are in the arrangements and all that sort of thing. And of course, discuss arranging techniques of some of the bigger arranger composers of the time.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm really fascinated. I kind of want to get a timeline of like how it all goes together, but that's sort of something we can talk about off the record.
Sure.
just to sort of sort it out in my own mind. I suppose we should start wrapping this up, though. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I think that everybody who is a band teacher in one way or another should know about this history. There is this gaping hole in knowledge between the Civil War and when Sousa starts. And that's just because the research just hasn't been there yet, and it hasn't filtered into the music education world. And this was a time when probably more Americans played band instruments by percentage of population than they even do today. It was just this time when the band was the popular music of the day, and I just think more people should know about that. And part of my mission these days is to make that more aware to people.
So now you mentioned to me that are you conducting the Newberry Victorian Concert Band?
I don't conduct the group. I founded it, but and I'm a decent conductor, but I like to put really good people in every chair. So I have Elisa Kohler, wonderful conductor and trumpet player, is our onstage conductor.
Is it typical to conduct from a musician spot in that era?
Yeah. In fact, whenever we have the opportunity, I ask her to actually hold a cornet, direct the band, and play some of the solo spots, because that's what in the 19th century the leader would have been also the best player in the group, and would have also played as well as conducted. And of course, most of those arrangements were dance arrangements. You kick them off. It's like a jazz band thing. You don't need to conduct anymore.
So, looking at this tradition and seeing how it evolved and then eventually sort of turned into the band, the modern band tradition, what challenges do you think we face in our era? And do we have any lessons that we can learn from the past?
Well, I think the primary lesson that we can learn from the past is that, band music, like any other style of music, adapts. It has to change with the aesthetics of the time. The one challenge I think that we face is that we always have to remember where band music came from. Unlike some of the other ensembles out there, band music rose as popular music. And I think one of the things that we forget sometimes, especially, as band directors who do, contest music and that sort of thing, we forget that band music was a popular music. And so our concerts really need to reflect that tradition. I think the British brass band tradition does that really well. Yes, they do their contests and things like that, but you go to England and you hear a British brass band playing, even the very finest ones. They're playing a lot of popular arrangements that people really, really like. So they remember their roots, and they keep their support in that way.
Yeah, I think that's really good. That's really valuable to think about it that way. The community bands we see much more popular music, but the contest music, of course, has nothing to do with that tradition.
Right. So I think, at the high school, the college level, and even some of the professional bands out there, you should remember that, when people come to a concert, yeah, they're going to listen to your art music, and there'll be a sprinkling of people in the audience who really, really appreciate that. I would be one of those. But most of your audience is going to want to hear something they can really relate to, played really, really well. And so I think if you're going to keep your community support, your financial support, all that sort of thing, you have to remember, what your ensemble was originally designed to do.
Yeah. Playing something people like really, really well is generally a formula for success.
I think so. Yeah. Sorry to be so obvious.
No, I think, but sometimes we need to say the obvious thing, right? We forget it sometimes. So what advice would you, if you could go back and talk to the Mike who is 20 years old, what advice would you give yourself looking back?
Well, a lot of the advice I probably wouldn't want to say on this podcast. It has to do with things quite non-musical. But I would tell myself, well, practice more and take ear training a whole lot more seriously than I did when I was younger. 20 years old, sophomore in college. because, and what I tell my students today, who sort of grumble about ear training, I tell you, this is the most important class you'll have at this university. If you're not already really good at it, you better make yourself extremely good at it. Because when you get into the professional world, and if you're fortunate enough to get at the very highest level of the professional world, everybody there has ears of gold. And they use them, all the time for incredibly important things. So I would have told myself to focus a lot more on my ear training.
Yeah, as an ear training professor, I can agree with you.
Well, as just a rank and file brass player, as somebody who's had to learn how to arrange sort of by trial and error, I really wish I had spent a lot more time getting good at it, especially being able, especially as I play the bass too, and a couple of times you show up to gigs and you just have to listen to the piano player and play what he's playing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, what's your favorite work for wind ensemble?
Oh, wow. My favorite work. That's probably everybody you ask that, has a hard time with that. On any given day, I could name a couple of things. Let's see, for wind ensemble, of course, I love the whole suites. I love, all that, English music written for military band. I love the American, Eastman school stuff, the Persichetti, all of that. Boy, to name a favorite, I'm just gonna have to pass on that question, man. There are just too many good ones.
How about a favorite piece by Thomas Coates?
Oh, favorite piece by Thomas Coates. Well, it has to be the same one that was the favorite of his time, and that was a piece, unfortunately, called "Plantation Echoes." Yeah. Well, it really was his finest work, and not only did he arrange it very well, but it's really some of the finest music of its day. We forget that minstrel music for the the American Minstrel Show, basically occupied the time of the best songwriters, from about the 1840s through all the way up to about 1900. And as unfortunate as the lyrics of a lot of this music is, it is some of the very finest music of its day. We know tunes like oh gosh, I'm blanking all of a sudden here. We know tunes like, of course, Camptown Races and I Dream of Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair, all this great Stephen Foster stuff, and Dixie and all these types of tunes. These are all written for the minstrel shows, and they were immensely popular. Well, Coates put a whole bunch of those all into one arrangement, and basically outdid himself as far as the transitions, the way that they're set, the harmonies. And it was reportedly played at his funeral. It was still popular in 1895.
Interesting. It makes me want to go back and look at some of that music and see if any of it can be arranged in a modern context.
Oh, certainly it can. It's some of the most tuneful stuff that you can imagine. Just don't use the words.
Oh, yeah, of course. And of course, not that title either. That's inappropriate in the modern context. Okay, so you mentioned that you're going to be presenting a paper on Thomas Coates at the annual meeting of the Society of Music in Kansas City. You mentioned in our correspondence that the Thomas Coates Brass Band is marching the New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade?
Yeah, our Civil War version of my band, the Coates Brass Band, we will be portraying the Irish Brigade Band, which never actually existed, but we'll be marching with the 69th New York reenactors for the 2018 St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York City. We did this back in, I want to say 2012 or 2011, I forget which year. It was a lot of fun, and it's right near the beginning of the parade, so it's great. We'll be playing a lot of Irish arrangements from the time, and there were tons of them. Almost every Civil War brass band books have some Irish music in them.
Oh, cool. Well, definitely anyone who's in the New York area for the 4th of July, for the St. Patrick's Day Parade.
March 17th.
Definitely, yes. You should definitely check that out. That's awesome. Okay, is there anything else you'd like to touch on?
Well, I just wanted to say thanks for giving me a chance to talk about early band music. There's still so much to learn. We're just at the very beginning of learning about this. There are a couple of good books I can recommend if you want to know more.
Yes, please.
One is Hazen's book called The Music Men. That one is a very nice overview of almost everything we've talked about today. Again, very, very, superficial, but a really great introduction. Let's see, my colleague Ken Kreitner wrote a book called Discoursing Sweet Music. And this is about one band in Pennsylvania, in Honesdale. And he talks a lot about these issues. And the Honesdale band sort of stands in as a representative for all of these bands of this time. It's a great little book to read, and you'll learn an awful lot about this era of band music.
Cool. I'll put these in the show notes and make sure, and I'm going to read them myself.
Okay. And then, there are dozens of other books about Civil War brass bands. Not nearly enough about the music of the 1870s and 80s. And of course, once you get into Sousa, a lot of people have written about him. So, and again, I encourage everybody to at least check out or maybe pick up a copy of the CDs by the Coates Band or Newberry's Victorian Cornet Band.
Great. And so you can be reached through Palm Beach Atlantic University, correct?
That's correct.
All right, great. Mike, thanks so much for this. This was wonderful.
Oh, Mark, thanks so much. I enjoyed this immensely.
Yeah, me too.